Happy summer, Digication community. We'd like to thank you for your loyal support of the first season of our podcast. Next week, Digication Scholars Conversations will begin a brief summer hiatus. We will return in the fall with brand new episodes featuring brilliant new guests, as well as a few favorites from past episodes.
Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Kelly Driscoll. In this episode, you'll hear part one of my conversation with J. Elizabeth Clark, a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Well, I am excited today in this episode of Digication Scholars Conversations to introduce J. Elizabeth Clark. And I first got to know Liz as part of her role at LaGuardia Community College with ePortfolios. She has lots of publications. I highly recommend people look into her in more detail after this conversation, but I am thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you today, Liz.
Hi, Kelly. It's so great to be here, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Yeah. So to kick things off today, I wanted to talk about a few things that I have discovered about you a little more recently.
Oh, no.
And they're all good things, I promise. But through these conversations, I just love to learn kind of how people got to where they are today. And you have a fascinating biography. And when I was exploring that, it just made so much sense that is all part of your journey in what you're doing now as an educator and the writing that you do. The kid lit, I had no idea about. So I hope you'll touch on that at some point during our conversation as well. Um, but I wanted
Sure.
to share a couple of little tidbits that I learned about you. First of all, I love the tagline that you have that stories that wonder and stories that matter. And that beneath that, you say, I'm a writer, diver, tech spelunker, ocean advocate, travels by fins or ferry. And I just love that. So first of all, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background in writing. It sounds like there was a lot of focus on poetry, and there likely still is today, and creative writing. And I would like to hear how that led you to teaching and led you to LaGuardia Community College specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like many people, I've always been a writer. I love to write. Before I could even put words on the page, I used to dictate stories to my mom, and I would chase her around the house and until she would take a break from whatever she was doing and then write down my stories. And so she's has saved some of them as blackmail, and they're pretty hilarious.
I
So
love
yeah, they
it.
make periodic appearances in completely embarrassing family situations.
Perfect.
And so, I was lucky to be able to, my parents really supported that. And so I was lucky to be able to always be writing through,
Mhm.
elementary school, middle school, high school. And then when I went to college, I was a creative writing major, and my graduate degree is in creative writing. I did end
Yeah.
up writing a literary critical dissertation on the poetry of HIV and AIDS. But even in that,
Yes.
I had my own poetry interspersed as chapter breaks throughout the
Oh, wow.
criticism that I was doing. So yeah, creative
Okay.
writing has been a huge part of my life, but I think sometimes more invisible in my scholarly life, because once I got to
Hmm.
LaGuardia, I was so immersed in technology and thinking about technology in our students that I really took on doing that kind of writing, which is very different than obviously the creative writing that I had been
Right.
doing before.
Yeah.
Yeah, but always I am always writing. I'm always writing
Yeah.
something.
It seems that way. Yeah, you have quite the kind of list of things that you've published, and so how does the Kid Lit fit into that journey as well? Because that was something that I didn't know about you.
Well, that's new. That is newer in the probably
Okay.
about the last decade. So that's not something that I studied in graduate school. In graduate school, well, actually, undergraduate and graduate school, I studied poetry all the way through. But after I moved to New York and when I was working on a lot of scholarly publishing, I just really felt called to start thinking about stories that were going to impact the next generation. And I didn't feel like that was something that I was doing in my poetry. And
Mhm.
so I really was very called to tell stories about the ocean. And think about how through fiction I might think about ocean advocacy. The
Mm.
ocean is a huge part of my childhood, a huge part of how I grew up. Although I grew up in landlocked Pennsylvania,
Yeah, I was
my
thinking, how
yeah,
did that work
my
out?
dad grew up in Jersey, and so
Okay.
every time we needed a break, we would just pile in the car
Yeah.
and drive to the beach for the day. So Sandy Hook, New Jersey, was the nearest ocean that
Mhm.
we could get to in a day, and do as kind of a day trip.
Mhm.
And so we would just go to the ocean. We also spent a lot of time in Maine,
Wonderful.
so I really was raised as an ocean kid, um, and very much an all season ocean kid. Not like going to the beach for the summer, but my parents' favorite time to go to the beach is when it is freezing cold. It is raining because no one else will be there. So
That
January on
is
the East
true.
Coast, so we can have the ocean to ourselves. Um,
Yeah.
but, obviously, as we have all witnessed, I mean, climate change is having such a devastating effect on the ocean. And as a scuba diver, that is also something that I am seeing under the ocean. And I've done a lot of
Mm.
volunteering with different conservation programs and just really wanted to think about how to transfer that into writing for kids.
Mhm.
So in my creative writing, that's what I've been focused on for the last several years.
Nice, nice. And
Yeah.
if we had children that we wanted to share some of these publications with, what should we look for?
So right now I have finished a novel which I am trying to get an agent for, and I have a second
Hmm.
novel that is I have just completed a draft of, but those are not
Got
published
it.
yet. So the children's
Not
writing
yet.
that I
Okay,
have,
so we'll have to
yeah,
stay tuned.
yeah, the children's writing that I have published is nonfiction science, and they're articles, particularly in Spigot Science.
Okay, great. We might share that as a resource, and it's wonderful that you're doing that. It's so important to get that understanding early, and I think through your experience, spending so much time at the ocean, it made a lot of sense for you. There's so many children that maybe have never even seen it, so having the opportunity to feel like they're a part of it through these stories and through the nonfiction too, I think will be enormous. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I also volunteer at the New York Aquarium. I'm on the dive team there, and on the dive team, I work as an educator for the dive team. So we're always thinking about how to talk with, particularly kids, because the aquarium is such a huge draw for kids and families about the ocean.
Hmm.
And one of the things that we're always talking about is that New York City is an island. We're
Right.
really an island, and we don't live like we're on an island, but we are on an island. So we like to talk with kids a lot about that. Like, did you know that you lived on an island, and what is that like? And what does that mean for how we live together in New York City?
Hmm. That's so great. Yeah, I just learned recently. My cousin's husband is a surfer, and he surfs right off of the island. And I had no idea that that was even possible. Even spending 15 years of my life in the New England area, so that's fabulous. And I don't know if you've ever gotten into surfing or if you prefer to be under the water, but I think it's remarkable.
I prefer to be under the water, but yeah, there's a very avid surfing community here for sure.
Fun. So, Liz, how did you find your way to LaGuardia Community College? And I wonder if you might also share, as a beginning teacher, what some of those early days were like for you.
Yeah, so those early days were a straight lead into ePortfolio. So I did my graduate work at Binghamton University. I did both my MA and my
Hmm.
PhD at Binghamton. And when I was at Binghamton, I was really lucky to work in the Binghamton Enrichment Program, which was a summer bridge program for students coming into the university. And that's really where I learned how to be a teacher. They had a phenomenal teacher training program that was run by Steve Duarte and a bunch of other folks who worked in the EOP program. And so when I went to Binghamton, I did not go to Binghamton thinking about teaching. I went to Binghamton as a poet. And my
Hmm.
mom is a faculty member, now retired from Penn State. And I remember that she read my application to be a teaching assistant. And she told me, my mom is my probably one of my biggest fans. But when I really need to hear something, she will tell me. So
Tells
this
you
is not,
straight.
yep, so it's not something I've heard a lot in my life from her, but she said, "This is really terrible. Like, you can't submit this." And I said, "What are you talking about? Like, it's an essay." And, I wrote this. She said, "At no time in this essay do you talk about your love of teaching. Like, I wouldn't hire you to teach. You're just talking about being a poet." And in fact, I did not get a teaching assistantship my first year at Binghamton. Um, and I think I was just totally focused on going to learn poetry and what I was going to do with
Hmm.
my craft, and that's where I was at. But once I started working in the BEP program, we part of our training we were reading pedagogy, we were talking about teaching for social change, we were talking about inequity and how the classroom could become a place to really challenge that. And I fell in love with the idea of social justice and teaching as a form of social justice, and
Hmm.
thinking
Hmm.
about how radical that space could be. So
Hmm.
once I finished my PhD, I knew that I really wanted to be at an institution that valued teaching, and where teaching was a priority. So I applied to LaGuardia and I had my interview, and I was offered the job. And so I packed everything up and moved to New York City. And it was daunting. I mean, moving from small town Pennsylvania to small town New York to New York City. But my whole entire life, I had always loved New York, and I had always told everyone that I was going to move to New York City. So, arriving in New York City was a big deal, but it was also, it was really challenging, um, just learning how to live there, and
Hmm.
how to acclimate to being in the city. And going to LaGuardia was a big change. The English program at Binghamton, although Binghamton is a pretty big school, the English program itself is pretty small. So we all knew each other, we knew all the faculty.
Hmm.
And LaGuardia is a big place. There's a lot of students,
Yeah.
a lot of moving parts. I mean, now that I've been at LaGuardia, for many years, we talk about the 7 train as really being a wonderful metaphor for LaGuardia, because the 7 train runs right through the middle of Queens. It's an elevated train.
Hmm.
People always think about the subway as being under the city, but we have a number of elevated lines. And so when you ride the 7 train, you really can see all of Queens out the window. But one of the first stops is LaGuardia. And so you get off the 7 train, and here it's just this entrance to this amazing multicultural, immigrant, multi-generational community. But finding a place there in the classroom and finding how to be useful as a teacher definitely took me some time, to find
Yeah.
my voice as a teacher, to find how I could be useful to my students.
Yeah.
But um, when I arrived at LaGuardia, we had a bunch of computer labs, and many people did not teach in the labs. So LaGuardia had invested in computer labs as a resource for our students, as was true when I started at LaGuardia and is still true today. Many of our students, up until the pandemic, did not have a lot of technology at home.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so we had up until right before the pandemic, traditional computer labs where students would come and do work. But they were also spaces that people needed to teach in. And my department chair put me in the computer lab and said to me, "Well, you just graduated from your graduate program. You must know what to do with computers so you can teach in the lab." And in fact, I had no idea what to do with the computers. I mean, I knew how to write on a computer. I had written my dissertation on a computer, but I did not know how to teach in a lab. So
Yeah.
immediately I was like, all right, this is a thing. And so I really started focusing on thinking about what pedagogy looked like, teaching in a lab, teaching with technology, what strengths our students had with technology, but also where we could really augment their learning through technology. And so
Hmm.
then that really became, one of the primary things that I focused on at LaGuardia is thinking about how to be a thoughtful pedagogue in a digital space with our students.
Mm. Beautiful. So, what were some of the first things that you remember kind of trying out? And
How to teach Microsoft Word.
and then how did that kind of shift? I'm just imagining. So, what year was it when you were like literally thrown into the deep end in that lab?
It was
Good thing you had
2000.
experience scuba diving.
Yeah, 2000. Yep. So
Okay.
I arrived at LaGuardia in 2000. And yeah, I mean, in the very beginning, it was like helping students learn how to open Microsoft and how to
Yeah.
format a document in Microsoft. I mean, it was not exciting stuff, but it was definitely things that in order to be competitive, in the
Hmm.
business world, students needed to know. And
Yeah.
one of the things that evolved into for me over time was really thinking about how I could model technology from the perspective of writing, right? So I'm not a
Hmm.
technology professor. I didn't
Right.
study technology, I studied writing, but I use technology all the time. In my professional life. So, really thinking about how you model the professional uses of
Yes.
technology in your discipline.
Yes. Oh, that's so great. I'm getting goosebumps because we actually started teaching at about the same time, Liz. And but I was not teaching in a writing program. I was teaching in an education program, and I had been brought in to teach the students how to use technology as a teacher. So we were exploring ways that their students could use it within the classroom, but also how they were going to be using it as a teaching tool, and also modeling that for my students as I was teaching them. So that's one of the kind of experiences that led to the creation of Digication, because we wanted there to be this space where students could create and publish and share and get feedback, and really have this kind of living piece of themselves that they could keep expanding on. So it's fun to hear about that part of your story, because it was around 2000. I was also teaching some students how to use PowerPoint. So yeah, Word and
Oh, yeah.
PowerPoint
Yeah.
and
Yep.
oh my
Yep.
goodness.
How to check their
And
email. how to log into
Yes.
email, although I'm still doing
Yeah.
that. So I don't seem to have conquered that because that's still a regular part of what I'm teaching.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was really pushing some things there because I was also trying to teach them how to create their own ePortfolio websites. But we were using, Flash and HTML. And they were like, Kelly, no, no, this is too much. So it's like, okay, well, let me build you something that can be a little easier. And here we are. So,
And here we
so
are.
and here we are. So, Liz, I wanted to hear a little bit about. So, you mentioned when you joined LaGuardia, ePortfolio was almost immediately kind of part of the work that you were doing there. Um, were you kind of on the ground starting it? Was there already a small team that was doing things? Tell me about how that um, kind of became a big part of what you were doing there.
Yeah. So before I arrived at LaGuardia, I think a year or two before, I'm not entirely positive on the dates, so don't quote me on the dates,
Mm-hmm.
but CUNY had moved to Blackboard. So
Mm-hmm.
this idea of using a course management system was very new at LaGuardia. And LaGuardia developed an amazing professional development program called Designed for Learning. And so this is really where I first experienced professional development as a faculty member, and I think learned how to do professional development also. It was a really important time for me. And the Design for Learning space was pretty amazing. We came together once a month for an entire year, and we learned how to change our face-to-face teaching for on some hybrid online learning spaces, and how to use learning management systems. And it
Mm-hmm.
was a playful space. It wasn't a punitive space. It was really an invitation to play with the technology and to figure out how the technology would fit into our pedagogy, and to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to marry those two together in a really creative and useful way. Um, so, out of Designed for Learning, which had been running the year before I started, and then became a program
Mhm,
that ran for several years at LaGuardia. Um, in 2001, our then dean, Paul Arcario, had the idea for ePortfolios, and he did a lot of the initial writing around ePortfolios. And he and Brett Einen, who then
mhm,
was our director for teaching and learning at the time,
mhm,
put together a research team to explore what portfolios would mean at LaGuardia. And it was a true research team. We were given 6 months to research. So they chose and invited faculty who had been through Design for Learning. So I was one of the 6 faculty members who was asked to participate in the research team. The research team was led by Maureen Doyle and James Richardson, my colleagues at LaGuardia. And at the time, there were, I think, 44 colleges and universities in the country who were using some form of digital portfolios. And we created
mhm,
a research protocol and we interviewed all of them. We called them, or we conducted email interviews to learn what portfolios look like on their campus. Some members of our research team also did a site visit. They did site visits to
mhm,
Kalamazoo and one other school, I don't remember which one, to see what it looked like in person. And then the whole team, we went out to Portland State. Where we met
mhm.
Terry Rhodes, who at the time was uh, was there, and
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So we really, when we got to Portland State and we saw how they were using portfolios, that felt like home to us. We were like, oh, we
Yeah.
understand these students. We understand what's happening here. This is this is the kind of thing that we want to build. And so
Mhm,
Portland very much became our mentors
mhm,
in learning how to create portfolios. Um, So yeah, so research teams. So we did research, then we wrote a white paper, then we created a pilot, and then we started to build from there.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for sharing that story and the history there, and how wonderful you were able to connect with Terry Rhodes at that time. And I
Yeah.
can just imagine him being equally excited about the group that you had there and what you were researching and some of your initial plans. Um,
Yeah, and also Judy Patton was also, I mean, such a huge mentor to
yes.
us, at the time in the beginning as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so you went back to your campus, with all of this new information, and you've got your white paper in hand, and you're starting to pilot. At that time, how would you kind of define what, for LaGuardia, why ePortfolios were going to be important to your community? What did it mean to the school at that time?
Yeah, so I'm gonna back up just for 1 second because we also had one other important step. We had invited Kathleen Blake Yancey to come to campus to advise
Mhm.
us on creating portfolios, and I will never forget that when we were meeting with her in one of our initial conversations, we had already been to Portland and came back, and she said, "Well, portfolios can do lots of different things. It can, do this and this and this." And we said, "Yes, we'd like to do all of that, please." And she was like, "No,
Just
no,
all of
no,
it.
no, 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 not all of it. Like, let's pick one or two things." And we are like, "No, yes, please. We would like to do all of those things. That sounds amazing." And she
Oh.
was, and so there was this moment when she was like, "I don't know that it will be amazing if you try to do all of those things." um, let's
I
focus.
love it.
But I think for us, and I do think the year here is important and the time is important because Facebook
Mhm.
did not really exist yet in a
Right?
space that we were in or that our students were in. So
Yeah.
initially, I think that portfolios were really on campus filling an important space. And that was a space where we could get to know our students outside the classroom.
Yeah.
Um, and that's
Yeah.
something that we talked a lot about early on. At the time, and there have been lots of changes in CUNY, but at the time, particularly for our developmental students, there were a number of high stakes tests. There was also a rising
Mm.
junior exam that CUNY students took. And I think there was, for many of our students, a feeling of being a number or a test. We
Right.
have a large number of students in our classes. We teach a large number of sections each semester. And so I think portfolios, we really felt that that was a way to get to know who our students were and to offer our students a space to think about what they were learning and begin to make those integrative connections between courses. So
Yeah.
early on, it was also a space where students were sharing what they were doing in the classroom with family who didn't live in the area. So it was
Yes.
very common for our students who had family who were living outside of the country to use their portfolios to share with their family what they were learning. And that was a
Yeah.
pretty amazing experience, as students were sharing that and getting feedback from friends and family afar.
Yeah, I just can imagine what a motivating factor that was to have their families and friends from wherever they had come from before they got there being able to witness all of the things that they were doing.
Yeah.
And I often find with students, with the day, they get very focused on the day to day and getting things done and getting to all of the classes, that sometimes it is that kind of moment where they get to share it with someone else, that they internalize the value of what they're doing as well, because they
Yeah.
can get
That
that feedback.
presentation quality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also think early
um
on for a lot of students, it was also a funky space to think about what we now know as multimodal. right? This idea
Right.
that you didn't just have to show what you were doing in class in written form. So there was a
Mhm.
lot of
Mhm.
really early experimentation with that that was super cool. Now
Mhm.
we wouldn't think of that as unusual or extraordinary, but at the time, that was a very much the idea of visual rhetoric was very much emerging in the portfolios in a new way.
Right. Right. And so, from your perspective as someone that was teaching writing, how did that shift in your classrooms? In kind of using, because that was so new. How did you help students kind of take that next step?
I think there were early on two things that I really focused on. The first was really thinking about how they could hyperlink their research and make their research
Hmm.
visible. So it wasn't just citing a source, but now I could
Right.
actually look at that source in real time. And I think that
Hmm.
changed a lot of our conversations about source material and why you quote source material and kind of making source material real and living. That was different. Also, definitely the visual. I'm a very visual person. I'm a visual learner. So, really helping students think about the place of the visual in writing was
Hmm.
important. And the portfolio is just it's just such a wonderful space for that, even today. To
Hmm.
be able to match or merge image and text. And I love when that happens. And so I was doing a lot when students were doing research papers of having them bring in images that were important to the research that they were doing or whatever they were writing about and
Yeah.
thinking about visual artifacts.
Wonderful. Um, and I was thinking about, when you were starting to form that, and there was also an article of yours that I've shared for many years that's about process. And I was interested in you sharing from your perspective how the process is such an important part of creating, whether you're creating with words or creating with words and imagery, or if you're creating by creating any portfolio, um, creating poetry. How does that process, what is that process all about? Because I think very often in some conversations that we have regarding e-portfolios, there's sometimes this kind of thinking that uh, it's just going to be that showcase, right? Or it's just going to be that
Right.
final artifact that's going to be assessed. So even though we've been kind of moving things forward, there's still a lot of that kind of history with e-portfolios that it often takes some coaching or examples or things to get people to see I think what Kathleen Yancey was getting in that early meeting, that there's so many different ways that it can be utilized, and how that process can kind of come into play. So I would love for you to share kind of your thoughts about process and how you might be kind of leading your students through that, or sharing the value of that with them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a real constant in my teaching and has been all the way through. So, although the ways that we share process are different in a more digital arena, the idea is not. And that is that
Hmm.
I really value leading students through stages of writing and
Hmm.
leading them through the idea that writing is infinitely malleable. So there's no such thing as the finished product. There is the thing, when am I ready to be done working on it? Because I've gotten it
Yeah.
as far as I'm going to get it now. But, I will talk with students about my own writing process, which is sometimes super fast and sometimes really excruciating when I'm doing draft after draft after draft. So for me, the portfolio is just such a wonderful space to capture that process from your initial brainstorming, or however it is that you're getting into the imagination process of whatever you're going to write. So if it's mind
Yeah.
mapping or it's listing, and then seeing how a piece of writing evolves from that into a draft, and then how you get feedback. And that feedback allows you to write a better draft and a better draft and a better draft. And I love the ways that the portfolio pushes students to really think about continuing to move a piece of writing from one
Mhm.
stage to another.
Oh, I love that. So when you talk about this with your students, and that the writing is never finished, do you get some curious glances? Like, well, we got to hand it in. So what does that really mean?
Yeah, I mean, that always leads to really interesting conversations, but conversations like, well,
Yeah.
5 years from now, if I am, researching climate change and I want to go back and use pieces of this, this essay that I wrote in your class, could I do that? Yeah, it's your writing, and you might want to go back and take some of those ideas and, recast them and recapture them. And, that is definitely part of the writing process. Lately, I don't know if I'll stick with this, but lately I've been talking with my students a lot about library of ideas, right? And so that you're
Mm,
you're constantly capturing these library of ideas, and maybe it just doesn't catch right now and it's not the thing that you want to continue working on, but later you might want to come back to it. So how do
right.
you create your own library of ideas that you can come back to when you're ready to actually do the project in the way that you envision it? The
Yeah.
way that you want to see it finished.
Yeah, and I'm imagining hearing you speak about it, that this might be something that you use in your own writing process. Is that true? I can
Oh,
imagine the
absolutely. Yeah.
library of
Yeah.
ideas that you've got stored up.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a pretty active library of ideas, or I'll write a first draft of something and then walk away from it and then come back to it like years later, because then it's the time. It wasn't the time, it was the time to capture the ideas, but not necessarily the time to execute it, at that moment. And so I love talking with students about that space.
This concludes part one of our conversation with J. Elizabeth Clark from LaGuardia Community College. To hear part two, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Digication Scholars Conversations is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative ePortfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. This episode was produced by Drew Albanesius and Amanda Driscoll. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for watching.